Hey, everybody, welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. And we have another really important topic to discuss today, and something that you're going to want to hear, because we're going to cut through all the nonsense, and we're going to give you the no kidding. Here's what's really going on. Here's what you need to know. And we have nobody better to talk about this today than Professor John Mearsheimer, who is an international relations theorist and professor of political science at the University of Chicago, who needs no introduction. Everybody knows who John Mearsheimer is. As we had him, I think the last time we were on, he's been right for decades. Has been prescient where most people have, not been able to see past the end of their nose. So, John, we're really happy to have you back again today. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Danny. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's unpack this, because we got a lot of mess to try to sort through, because there's a lot of, I don't know if disinformation is the right word or lack of understanding. I'm not sure what the right phrase to put on it is, but there's a lot of confusion out there, I can say for sure, of what exactly is going on in the Russia-Ukraine war. Now that we've completely through this, complete total failure of a summer offensive by the Ukraine side. Now then we're trying to figure out what's going to be next and what should happen and what might happen. Of course, the biggest issue on the table for the United States right now is that there's still a delay in whether we're going to provide any money to Ukraine after whatever it was between the United States and Europe. It was $200 billion in the first year and a half or so. But now then, as you're going to see here in a second, we have reached the end of all the money we have allocated. And now then we're kind of stuck at a $61 billion request from the administration, at which they've been trying to get passed since last September, haven't gotten it done, still haven't gotten it done. And the question is, what is the implication if we don't? Now, I want to look at what's the implication even if they do come across this money. What is realistic to expect in 2024? Because the operating thesis seems to be that, can Ukraine hold for 2024 and build power and combat power for 2025? So the question that we want to talk today, can the Ukraine side play defense in 2024 and have a shot at the offense in 2025? Now, we're going to look at some things here in a second, but I just wonder just kind of what's your off-the-cuff bottom line on that question.
Well, I think it's ridiculous to think that Ukraine can hold the line in 2024 and then eventually take the offensive. That's just not going to happen. They took the offensive this past summer, and it was a colossal failure. And there's no way that we're going to arm up and train the Ukrainians by 2025 so that they'll be in a position to overwhelm the Russians, who are arming up their forces and training their forces more effectively than we are. I think that the best that we can hope for is that the Ukrainians maintain the status quo in 2024, and I'm talking here about the status quo on the battlefield, and then they can do that into 2025. The real danger is that the Ukrainians are going to be defeated by the Russians over the course of this year and next year. That, I think, is the more likely outcome, that the Russians will just roll back the Ukrainians. But the best we can hope for, again, is to stalemate the Russians. The idea that Ukraine is going to launch some offensive in 2025 and, turn the tide is delusional.
Well, there seems to be a lot of delusion going on, and let's just take a look at some of it. But before we get to the delusionary part, I want to look at a couple of people who are actually looking at this pretty soberly, and I think have a pretty good idea and a pretty good grasp of it. And it's almost embarrassing to say, but the first one we're going to go to is a Russian source, which, of course, we typically say everything that comes out of a Russian's mouth is lies and disinformation, but sometimes it's the truth. And here we have Minister of Defense Shoigu kind of laying out pretty plainly how things look on the battlefield.
За прошедший год потери противника превысили 215 тысяч человек и 28 тысяч единиц вооружения. Мы сохраняем стратегическую инициативу на всей линии боевого соприкосновения. Несмотря на истощение людского ресурса украинских формирований и отсутствие результатов на поле боя, Соединенные Штаты Америки хладнокровно пытаются реализовать свои амбиции на мировое лидерство за счет жизни украинцев. С подачи западных кураторов киевский режим продолжает гнать на убой своих солдат и ищет любые возможности для восполнения рядов украинской армии. Безусловно, это не изменит ситуацию на линии боевого соприкосновения, а только затянет военный конфликт. Продолжим последовательно достигать целей специальной военной операции.
Now, if people think that, okay, well, you're just listening to the Russian side, and of course they're going to give a rosy picture, let's talk to somebody who was actually the spokesman for Zelensky at the beginning of the war until actually just recently, a guy named Arestovich, who was in an interview just a couple of days ago, being very honest about what things look like from the Ukrainian side, and you'll see some similarities between these two views.
14,000 Russian recruits getting every month to the recruiting centers. And Putin now doesn't need mobilization. He didn't need mobilizations because he has a lot of voluntary recruitment people, which is completely different with the Ukrainian system. Now we try to provide a huge mobilization as a 500,000 personnel, and we face some obstacles, serious obstacles with motivations for people, something like that.
Do you believe that those four things mean that Russia and Mr. Putin are in a different position now to what they were when you were working for Volodymyr Zelensky at the start of the war?
Absolutely. They're now in the much better position than the war started.
So what happens to Ukraine then if American support falls away, either through a change of administration or because the current administration loses enthusiasm?
So the stopping of financial, it's mean we lost the macroeconomical stability. It means the social payment, pensions and something like this to provide social aid for our people. And it's mean we have to start to insufficient our gold and currency depots, our national bank. It's mean the hryvnia, which is getting in inflations. And in front line, it's mean we start to lose the territory because Russians still have a superiority in artillery shells, number of shells, rockets and something like this, personal, armored carrier, tanks, and that's all.
Well, he seems to say the same thing as you do. The issue is not can we maintain the status quo, is that can we keep from even losing? And he's even saying, and that matches what Shoigu is talking about with all these huge numbers of losses, that now Ukraine is having to mobilize, or at least they're seeking to force mobilize 500,000 people. But there's one other thing from that interview I want to point out here, which was very eye-opening for me, and that is that there is a massive attempt on the behalf of those remaining people in Ukraine that don't want to be mobilized. Check out the number of people who are trying to avoid mobilization.
Men of Ukraine, which is half of the men population of Ukraine, do not want to get in a recruiting center to give their dates. It's not mean they will be recruitment. They not even want to check their personal date.
4.5 million people have refused to give their information because it means they could be called up to the front.
Yes. This is a problem.
Yeah, this is a problem. So you have the juxtaposition of the Russian side, after nearly 2 years of war, have 14,000 volunteers per month. They've only had one forced mobilization to fill an emergency need that they had in the fall of 2022. And since that time, they have grown hundreds of thousands by volunteers. Whereas in the Ukraine side, after these huge casualties and a much smaller manpower pool that they can even draw from, are chasing people down because they don't have enough and they're doing everything they can to get away. Where is the basis to hope that Ukraine will be able to hold the line in 2024?
I agree with everything you say, but let me add 3 other problems that the Ukrainians face. First of all, is the weaponry issue. We're going to give lots of money, I believe, to the Ukrainians, and the EU will do the same thing. But they don't need money as much as they need weapons, and we don't have the weaponry to give them. So that's point one. Point two is if you look at what's happened in the air war, the Russians have basically eviscerated the air defenses in Ukraine. So they're now free to attack all sorts of targets in Ukraine, near the front lines and deep in Ukraine, and do all sorts of damage. This is a huge force multiplier for the Russians. And then finally, if you look at the political situation inside of Ukraine, what you see is all sorts of trouble. Zelensky, who, of course, General Zelensky, who is the general who basically is in charge of the Ukrainian military, is at war with President Zelensky, and there are all sorts of other players now coming into the game. So you have this fractious political situation that could even lead, to a coup or possible assassination, who knows, inside of Kiev. On the other hand, if you look at the political situation in Russia, you remember the days when we used to talk about the fact that the Wagner group was going to topple Putin, and Putin was in a precarious position. Everybody was wondering who was going to replace him and if we were going to live happily ever after as a result. Those days are gone. Putin is in the catbird seat. Excuse me, Daddy. It's the Ukrainians who are in deep trouble. So everywhere you look here, Ukraine is in deep trouble, and the Russians are doing quite well.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, just to highlight what you just said there, here is a recent pronouncement by Minister of Defense Shoigu talking about how the Russian side on their own is starting to expand a lot of key weapon systems and ammunition. Check this out.
С февраля 2022 года, то есть с начала специальной военной операции, увеличен выпуск танков в 5,6 раза, БМП в 3,6 раза, бронетранспортеров в 3,5 раза, беспилотных летательных аппаратов в 16,8 раза, артиллерийских боеприпасов, что крайне важно, в 17,5 раз. Сеть учебно-методических центров «Авангард» стала основой. По поручению Верховного Главнокомандующего решены масштабные задачи по фортификационному оборудованию рубежей обороны. На всем протяжении линии боевого соприкосновения, которая составляет более 2000 километров, создано 7000 километров минных полей. Кулак-Февральск протяженностью 339 километров.
Literally every category of weapons you can be talking about: armor, APCs, rockets, mines. I mean, everything that you need to wage war are now being domestically produced within Russia. And of course, we know they're still getting a lot of stuff from the Iranians. Apparently, they just signed some new accord with them to maybe make that even more large scale weapon, artillery shells, and now rockets apparently coming from North Korea as well. So they're firing on all cylinders here. Meanwhile, for Ukraine's side, now Zelensky loves to say that, okay, we're going to start producing ammunition and artillery shells and drones of our own. But as you just pointed out there, they don't have good air defense cover. So these facilities keep getting hit by Russian missiles. But now then, in terms of their allies who can provide, here's what John Kirby says about our bank account.
Military assistance to Ukraine? I mean, has the well really run dry here, or what does it look like?
We have issued the last drawdown package that we had funding to support, and that's why it's critical that Congress move on that national security supplemental request and we get more funding. The assistance that we provided has now ground to a halt. The attacks that the Russians are conducting are only increasing. And now, as I talked about earlier this week, they're using North Korean ballistic missiles to do their dirty work. So the need is acute right now.
Now, in light of all of these comparisons and contrasts that we just have shown there, you said it at the first of this episode here, you used the word delusional thinking. Now, I don't like to demean anyone, but based on all that, here is a recent comment by Zelensky about how confident he is.
Ukraine's defense industry is not just recovering, it is becoming as productive as it needs to be for a modern, technology-driven warfare. For the next year, we have set ourselves crystal clear goals in terms of artillery, drones, missiles, and armored vehicles. One of our major political results this year is an agreement with our partners, particularly the United States, on co-production of weapons.
I'm not sure what good a lot of that's going to do if they don't have the air defense to be able to protect it, even if those things come to pass. But as you know, John, better than probably anybody, it takes years to get that kind of thing up and down to where it's actually producing. And Ukraine may not have months. So when you hear all of these contradictions in different viewpoints, what do you think is going to happen, say, in the next 6 months even?
Well, I think what will happen over the next 6 months is that the Russians will continue to use air power to tear apart that industrial base, that military industrial base that Zelensky was talking about building, attacking troop concentrations, attacking all sorts of other targets deep in Ukraine. And at the same time, I think the Russians, who are training up more and more troops and who have more and more troops who are getting battle experience, will slowly but steadily push the Ukrainians westward and end up conquering more territory. And I think the Ukrainians are going to have a very difficult time hanging on in the next 6 months, in large part because they're not going to be getting a lot more weaponry. We don't have the weaponry to give them. We can give them money, but money doesn't solve the problem. They need weapons. They need artillery tubes. They need artillery shells. They need tanks, all the weapons you were listing before and Shoigu was listing. They don't have those weapons. And furthermore, if you look at the manpower situation, you read all sorts of stories in the Western press, not in the Russian press, in the Western press, that says most of their soldier recruits these days are old or feeble or have medical problems of one sort or another that make them not very effective combat soldiers. So this is an army that's worn out, not showing any signs of improving in the near future. And it's up against a Russian army that's getting bigger and bigger and is more and more well-trained. And I think the end result is that the Russians will win a series of victories over the next 6 months and further damage the Ukrainian military.
Now that's one of my concerns because of the reaction that I'm afraid that's going to generate beyond Ukraine. And I'm talking about in Western Europe / NATO, and in many quarters here in the United States are also talking about now then they're afraid, after basically talking about how awful Russia was for the first 2 years and you know, they couldn't hit their way out of a wet paper bag and they had terrible leadership, no morale, all those kinds of things. Now, all of a sudden, it's almost flipped 180 degrees. And now we're worried about World War III. You had Germany just had allegedly a leak of this map with a bunch of these big arrows talking about how, you know, there's going to be a major war with Russia here in the not too distant future, 9 steps to World War III. You have the Minister of Defense for Sweden telling his people for the first time in 210 years, we may be having a war. And you also had, let's see, Poland, but the Polish prime minister, the foreign minister was warning just a couple of days ago on CNN. And then now earlier today, I saw by a comment by the Estonian prime minister, Kaja Kallas, who's saying the same thing, that war is coming. And in fact, in the article where that was mentioned, it says retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. forces in Europe, corroborated the concerns raised by Kallas, warning that Russia could initiate a world-altering conflict if it proceeds NATO to be unprepared. He asserted that readiness and strength are vital deterrents against aggression, cautioning, quote, if they did it, it would be because they made the assessment that we are not ready or unified inside the alliance, or that we did not have adequate ammunition or the ability to move fast enough. One of the, I believe the German claims was that by the summer of 2025, they think Russia could be moving on into the West. Now, some of those fears, some of the things that people are using to say those fears is something that Putin also said, I believe, earlier today when he laid out his view of where this war is going.
Если дальше будет продолжаться то, что сейчас продолжается, то, что сейчас имеет место быть, а сейчас это совершенно очевидно, не только провалилось их контрнаступление, инициатива полностью находится в руках российских вооруженных сил. Если так будет дальше продолжаться, украинской государственности может быть нанесен невосполнимый, очень серьезный удар. Будет тогда результатом их политики, их правления.
Now, that's not too dissimilar from what you just speculated here about the delusional thinking and the unwillingness to find off-ramps, as I think we've talked about on previous episodes here, about ways we could have ended this before, which would have left Russia in a weakened position. But now then, the longer it goes on, because of their economic impact, output, their military-industrial complex, their larger forces, you know, their use of new technology on the battlefield they didn't even have before, A lot of these things are making them stronger. So the question is, would Russia be in a position to actually move into Western Europe in a conventional state? Would they have any interest? What do you say when you hear all these comments about fears of World War III in Europe?
I think this is ludicrous. I mean, first of all, the Russians are in effect stuck in eastern Ukraine. It's not like they're on the Polish border now. The big question on the table, in my mind, is how much territory, if any, they will capture over the next few months. I think they will end up capturing some territory. But the idea that they're on the verge of decisively defeating Ukraine is not a serious argument. Furthermore, Putin has made it clear that he has no interest in conquering Western Ukraine. He's now talking about countries like Poland and Romania grabbing territory in Western Ukraine that used to belong to them. He doesn't say, I want that territory for Russia. He's saying Romania and Poland are going to want that territory. I don't believe that will happen, but nevertheless, it's just evidence that Putin is not talking about conquering all of Ukraine. He's made it clear he has no interest in conquering countries in Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states, and he would be foolish to try to do so. So the idea that, he's going to conquer all of Ukraine, then go on a rampage against NATO, and we're going to have World War III is, I think, a ridiculous argument. The question, I think, that is very interesting based on these stories that you see popping up now that you were describing is what the West is going to do, and more particularly what NATO is going to do if the situation in Ukraine deteriorates over the next few months, as I described it. And again, when we talk about deterioration, we're not talking about all of Ukraine falling under control of the Russians. We're just talking about the Russian steamroller, in a sense, moving westward, the Russians capturing territory in Odessa and Kharkiv and so forth and so on. If that begins to happen, and it looks like Ukraine is really going to turn into a dysfunctional rump state, and we're going to have mud all over our face, we meaning NATO, what will the United States and its allies do then? And I think, there is reason to worry that we may try to intervene to rescue the situation, especially if it looks like the Ukrainian military is beginning to collapse.
Wait, intervene in what way?
Maybe send forces in.
Okay, that would be a problem. That's a no-go. But you think that people are actually thinking that way in the White House, or they might think that way in the whether it's in Brussels or Washington?
Who knows? When you look at Western decision-making in recent times, it's hard to have much confidence in the decisions that these folks make. And I think it is possible that we would try to rescue the situation. We are deeply committed. And furthermore, as you point out from all those articles, aren't people saying that we should get ready for World War III? Isn't that what they're saying in those articles? We should get ready for World War III. Well, if you believe what's being said in those articles, that's not inconsistent with us trying to use some form of limited force. What if the Ukrainian military, just think about this, what if the Ukrainian military shatters in June of this coming year? I'm not saying that will happen, but it is a possibility, right? It just shatters. What do we do then? And the Russians start moving westward, and they're on the doorstep of Kyiv. What do the Americans do?
That is, I totally agree. That is a genuine, I think, concern that has gotten very little thought in even the Western mind, much less even the leadership here, because the assumption, the absolute assumption is that the status quo will be maintained, that the line of contact will be maintained through 2024, and we're already looking to 2025 and what we can do here. But what happens if there is a collapse? We had Michael Vlahos on here a couple of months back talking about the possibility and historically what has happened when armies break unexpectedly, and you never know when it's going to come or even if it's going to happen. But sometimes when they do come, it's a catastrophic collapse, and all of a sudden there's no defense left. And then what happens if we go then? No one's thinking about do we want to do that? Now, I remember, John, I don't know if you heard anything about this, but in the first 5 or 6 weeks of the war, there was some talk here in Washington among some quarters that said that there was some consideration among the White House that if the Russians did continue to break through and actually did have some of these big aerial movements, that they might want to move some U.S. troops into Western Ukraine as a assist, or they want to do some training on the ground there as a bulwark and a tripwire, so to speak, to prevent Russia from coming in. Now, I don't know if those were true at the time, but I can imagine that kind of thinking would come back into play pretty quick and try to shore up the situation here, which could, again, have catastrophic consequences.
I think, Danny, that is highly unlikely, but it is a plausible scenario, right? In other words, the Ukrainian army shatters, and we're deeply fearful that the Russians will move to the Polish and Romanian border. And what we do is we put some troops in Western Ukraine, and we send a very clear signal to the Russians that we're not interested in fighting them. Those troops are there purely for deterrence purposes, to keep the Russians out of Western Ukraine. And the story we tell ourselves is that deep down we believe the Russians are not interested in Western Ukraine. They've made that clear. Furthermore, they would end up trying to absorb all of these ethnic Ukrainians who want nothing to do with the Russians and actually hate them. So we could tell ourselves a story that went along the lines that even if we put these forces in, we wouldn't have to worry about it escalating, as long as we communicated clearly with the Russians that we were not interested in reconquering territory or fighting with them. So it could happen. I think it's highly unlikely we would do that. But
well, so if you think that's unlikely, what is likely in the event of a break and a collapse? What is likely in your view?
Well, I think that we will have to live with the fact that the Russians will end up conquering more territory. I've long argued that they would take the 4 oblasts west of the 4 oblasts they control now, or they've annexed so far. And they may even take a bit more. And I think there would be nothing we could do to prevent that. But we would do everything we could to sort of reconstitute the Ukrainian forces, shore them up, and do what we could to negotiate with the Russians to make sure that they didn't take all of Ukraine and that this rump Ukrainian state remained intact.
Well, what worries me is that this, just call it what it is, this arrogance and hubris on the part of many in the West, and certainly in the United States, that no, we're the most powerful nation on earth. I think we've had, Gary, I don't know, you play it enough times. We had that statement by President Biden, where he was asked a question early in this war: can we do Ukraine and Israel at the same time? And his response was pretty consistent with what you might expect. That no, of course, we're this incredible country. We can do anything we want. We're the most powerful nation in the history of the world. And I'm afraid that mentality could influence some decisions, and people will be afraid of, oh my God, the Russians won, we lost. That's not possible. We have to do something. And there's lots of Petraeus and Hodges and several of these other guys that have been cheerleading this whole time. They are going to go crazy suggesting that we do more. And I think there'll be a lot of pressure on the White House to do something stupid.
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world.
See, because if he doesn't act on that, then people are going, wait, that was a lie. We aren't, because they yeah, that's true. So if that's true, then we have to, you see where that could go. That's what worries me.
Yeah. 2 points. One is, it's very clear that most American foreign policy elites do not have a healthy sense of the limits of military force. I often say this is because most of these people have never served in the American military, and they don't understand what a blunt instrument it is, and what the extent to which it's of limited utility for a lot of different scenarios. They're just not very Clausewitzian, to put it in academic speak, when it comes to thinking about the limits of military force. And Joe Biden is a classic case of this. He just thinks that, America can pull out its gun and get what it wants by threatening people, or if it has to, using that gun. But in my opinion, that's not the way the world works. But to put your point in slightly different terms, what worries me less than the arrogance is more the desperation. You want to remember that there are a lot of people who are deeply involved or deeply committed in this war. They have a lot invested in this war. People like David Petraeus and so forth and so on. They have been huge supporters of the war from the beginning, and they have predicted victory at almost every turn. And if Ukraine collapses and it looks like it's going to clearly lose the war, that's going to have huge consequences for their reputation. And they're going to want to do everything they can to rescue the situation.
Yes.
And in a situation like that, when you combine desperation with arrogance, and that arrogance is there for sure, I'm not saying you're wrong, but the desperation plus the arrogance could lead to us getting ourselves into a hell of a lot of trouble by putting military forces in Ukraine.
Now, John, let me ask you in the last few minutes we have here, let's look a little bit off the battlefield here and look at the ramifications for I guess the state of affairs, the global state of affairs. Now, before this war started, you had George Bush's infamous axis of evil, that they talked about here. But with our enemies, pretty much, or our adversaries, you had China kind of over here, Russia over here, North Korea over here, and Iran over here. And they didn't really move a lot together because everybody has economic incentives to not do that, because we had a lot of levers we could pull in, prior to February 2022. But now that a lot of those constraints have come off, now then we have overtly, I think just yesterday, Russia and Iran signed some sort of agreement. We'll see what that's going to entail in here. And now I believe earlier today you had North Korea coming over, and look how enthusiastic Putin is here, meeting one of the officials from North Korea. And of course, we know that North Korea's been helping with artillery shells, apparently with missiles as well. Iran is doing a lot more with drones. You have Russia and China, of course, with this eternal friendship, and who knows, really where all that's going. But the bottom line is, almost however this issue in Ukraine is eventually solved, we seem to have moved a lot of these people together in ways they never were before. And I just can't imagine that's going to be good for us long term.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, as you point out, we've pushed countries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and assorted other countries as well together. But you want to remember that during the unipolar moment, China and Russia were not great powers. During the unipolar moment, by definition, we were the sole great power on the planet. So we had a massive power advantage over everybody, to include the Chinese and the Russians, and we had not driven all these countries together. Now we're in a situation where we're in a multipolar world. There are three great powers, Russia, China, and the United States. And we've played a very important role in driving the Russians and the Chinese together, and the North Koreans and the Iranians as well. So we're in deep trouble. And, here we're talking about Ukraine, and you occasionally mention the Gaza war, where we're also up to our eyeballs and alligators. But most importantly, there's East Asia, which is where China's located, and China is a peer competitor. And it's possible that you could have a major crisis at any point in East Asia over Taiwan, and I think more likely over the South China Sea, and even possibly over the East China Sea, or on the Korean Peninsula. So there are three theaters out there that we have to worry about: the Middle East, Europe, Eastern Europe in particular, and East Asia. And the question is, do we have the ability to deal with all three of those areas at once if we face serious problems in each one of those areas simultaneously? And I don't think we have that capability.
Yeah, and I tell you, John, that's what concerns me, the long range stuff, far more than the narrow tactical stuff, as big as that is in a war of the size of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But it's what's already happened. I mean, there's some things that are already beyond they've already rolled over the top. They're never coming back. And we better start figuring out how we're going to manage these things going forward, or our interest, both economically and national security, could suffer, in the future. And our leverage is going way down and our vulnerabilities are going way up. And we need to start, cutting off some of the damage that's been done, ending some of these problems so that we can start getting back to fixing things. But, that also requires some humility and some recognition that what you just said is true, not whether you want it to be or not. It just is, that the world is no longer a unipolar moment. It is now multipolar, no matter what anybody wants. And the longer we refuse to accept that and say that we need to start dealing with the world as it is and start doing something that's going to tamp things down and try to start working more for our interest, which is diplomacy, which we don't like to do a lot of. And that's what worries me long term more than this.
2 quick points, Danny. One is, we in all likelihood will get more deeply involved in Ukraine over time and more deeply involved in the Middle East over time. Second point is that I was recently at a conference that was run by South Koreans, and a question that came up that I found quite fascinating, that concerned the South Koreans very much, is what if you have simultaneous crises in East Asia? In other words, conflict breaks out over the South China Sea, and conflict breaks out or is threatening to break out on the Korean Peninsula. Do you see what I'm saying? 2 crises in East Asia. So when I was arguing before that we have to think about East Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, now what I'm saying is you have to worry about the Middle East, you have to worry about Europe, and you have to worry about the possibility of 2 conflicts breaking out in East Asia. I'm not saying that's likely at all, but it is a possibility. And to go
it's no longer a fringe possibility. And the more we go, especially if you're right, and we do get more deeply involved in both the Middle East and in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I think the chances of that other happening increase to whatever they are. They're higher than they are now. And that's a worrisome trend.
Yeah. And by the way, you look at what's happening in the Middle East now. I mean, there is the war in Gaza, right? What happens if Hezbollah and Israel get into a fight? And we are firing away at the Houthis. And I see no way that's going to end in a way that we can declare victory. I mean, we're either going to have to walk away with that and have egg all over, walk away from that scenario and have egg all over our face, or we're going to continue fighting for a long time against the Houthis. This is not in the American national interest, in my opinion.
Sir, it is not. And we're going to leave it there for right now, because this is, this is ongoing. And listen, we are really grateful for you making the time to come on our show, because I know you're in great demand all over the world. And we're very grateful for your time here. And hopefully in the future, when some of these things keep developing, we'd like to have you back again to give us your update. But thank you for coming on today, John. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Danny.
And that's our show for today. We're going to have a couple more deep dives for you tomorrow. That's you're not going to want to miss. Tune into that. We always have them updated on our website and on our YouTube homepage. Always look to that. Be sure and like and subscribe, so that way you get alerted every time we have these shows, because I'm telling you folks, you're getting stuff here you're just not getting anywhere else. And we're going to give you the straight skinny, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the information you need to make sense of a very chaotic world, and good advice on how we can avoid some of the worst outcomes. And we just hope that some of our policymakers start paying attention to the likes of John Mearsheimer. Thanks for that, and we will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.